And we're live. Awesome.
Sweet.
Well, sweet. Great to have you on. If you could give your name and then a little bit of a background into who you are and what you do, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'm Josh Perez. I'm a photographer and creative producer and podcast host based out of Denver, Colorado. Been out here 6 years.
Awesome. Wonderful. I like your glasses, by the way. I just recently got some clear ones and they look steezy.
Thanks. They're just reading glasses and for the computer. But yeah, I went to the eye doctor and they told me I had like two tiny holes in my eye. And so I kind of like freaked out, and now I wear them because, yeah.
Interesting. Well, they look good.
Thanks.
So I was interested in a little bit of your background to start, just because I had seen that you were originally from North Carolina. Is that correct? And now you're in Denver?
Yeah, sort of. I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. I
Okay.
was there till, about 18, and went to college in North Carolina and then moved out here 6 years ago. So I spent like 5, 6 years in North Carolina. So not from there, but spent some time there.
Gotcha. Interesting.
Yeah.
So how did you end up getting into kind of like the outdoor and like creative intersection side of things? Because it seemed like the like store manager position that you had at Topo was maybe the first dive into that.
Yeah, it is. And is that how we sort of got connected, by the way?
I think it might have been, to be honest. I'm not sure, but that was what I had thought, because I remember going there a few times over the last couple of years, because I have a couple friends from the Denver area, and I remember like starting to check things out and dropping through kind of just as Topo had really like hit the map. So I'm
Yeah.
sure that had something to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I moved to Denver, like I said, about 6 years ago, and I'd been following Topo Designs through different blogs. And when I moved to Denver, I just realized that I had moved about two blocks away from the flagship store, and Topo was tiny then. I mean, it was I think 4 or 5 employees when I first moved to Denver.
Oh,
And
wow.
I just went into the store because it's one of those brands that I followed forever, but I never actually had purchased anything. And so went into the store, met this guy, Adam Wells, who was another early employee there. And he mentioned there was going to be a party, which if you've heard of Howler Brothers, another outdoor company, it was this collaboration party. And so I went over to the store one of those nights, or the night of the party, and Mark Hansen, who is one of the owners and founders, he poured me a shot of whiskey and we just kicked it. And yeah, he said something along the lines of like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I didn't have a job at the moment, or I think I was coaching CrossFit, and told him I was open to looking around and stuff. And yeah, he offered me a position. I mean, back then I was there. Let's see, it was like number 6. So at that moment, it was sort of like, "Hey, do you want to work here?" There's no real like job titles. It's just, "Do you work here? Yes or no?" Cool. So yeah, that was sort of how I started there. It wasn't, it wasn't as crazy as like trying to join Google or this crazy interview process or anything. It was like meet the owner at a party, and yeah, we just connected. And a couple weeks later, I was working at Topo. So my role in the beginning when I first started was a little bit of warehouse, a little bit of store, a little bit of helping on some social media. Yeah, kind of
That's
all over.
awesome.
Yeah, early days.
So you got thrown right into the deep end with that, huh? Because that, like, when you only have that many employees, you tend to kind of get your feet wet with a lot of different things going on, especially like, when you're able to get into more of the warehouse side of things, because that's when you really get to see how things are coming in and out and what's all going on.
Yeah, what's really cool is at that point, because my hands were involved in so many different things, especially on the retail side of things and also shipping, I was so connected to the customers that I got to really see and learn like who Topo's customers around a way that is pretty unique, and you sort of only get that when you're at a startup,
Still there? It looks like it paused for a second.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
cool.
still here.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, had you followed much of the outdoor industry prior to getting into that experience, or was that kind of just like a happenstance? Like I moved to this city and all of a sudden, this whole kind of other world opened up.
Yeah, I'd followed the outdoor industry through blogs and outside magazine and stuff. I mean, being in North Carolina, it's a recreational state for sure, but I was never I didn't know how to get involved. I didn't know how you find jobs in the outdoor industry. Or I thought if you were trying to join the outdoor industry, that meant you got to be a guide of some sort, whether it's a rafting guide, a climbing guide. I mean, I knew there was retail, like there's REI and stuff like that. And so you can work retail. I'd followed it, but didn't really know how to transition. I also didn't know that I could make much of a career out of it. So I wasn't necessarily dying to be in the space, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't really have a super clear career path in the outdoor industry. I just thought it was cool.
You just jumped into it. That's cool though, because I think there's like this interesting mix of how people end up getting into that space, but also how they end up molding it with more of the creative side of things, just because it's like it tends to be two things that most people don't necessarily correlate with each other. And I think it's maybe where some companies have had difficulties in the past is trying to get employees that are paying more attention to the forward kind of tech scene and how that's, working with all these systems, and then also having appreciation for the outdoors, because they're like two very different sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, and I lucked out really with Topo Designs because being such an early employee, Jed Rose, who's the other founder, so Jed kind of runs a lot of the design and Mark runs a lot of the operations. And between the two of them and being such an early employee, I just got to learn a lot. And the other people who were working there are also some amazing creative folks. And I still stay in touch with everyone who was there at that time, which is really cool. And watching their career paths and where they've gone after Topo Designs, it's really cool to see. I mean, I think it was something special, like the kind of first 5-6 people. Not that it isn't special now, but there was something really cool about the time I was there. And it impacted me pretty big.
Yeah.
Or in a pretty big way.
Well, it's crazy that they had only had, you said you were the 6th employee, like that they had only had 6 when the store was kind of already up and running too.
Yeah, it was, let's see, Lee or Jules, I always forget who was first, and then like Adam, Dalton, Josh, and then me. So yeah, I was the 6th person. Yeah, it was a small team. I think they were doing a lot with a small team in a good way.
And I know they recently hired a new dude for marketing that actually came from Goal Zero, who I kind of know through some other people like in the Utah scene.
Yes, James Akan. He was actually the first episode on my podcast, and I met James when he was at Goal Zero probably 4 or 5 years ago, and he's got a crazy, amazing story and really cool guy. Had a blast on the podcast. He was my first episode, so we actually did it twice because I was learning so much about recording. But yeah, he came from Goal Zero, then he spent some time at Black Diamond, and then from Black Diamond came over to Topo Designs. He's been at Topo, I think, about a year and a half.
Okay, gotcha.
Really good guy. He's gonna do some sweet stuff there.
Yeah, I think that might be the other connection that we had too, because I had like kind of on the outsides gotten to know him through someone that I had worked with at Jaybird, because she had previously been at Goal Zero. So it's like it's always just like 1 or 2 connections. Yeah, I had been there for a little bit.
Oh, maybe that's how I know you.
Yeah, there's always a couple different levels of how it works out.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what was it like after that? Like, had you been involved in more of the like quote unquote creative side of things? Like, because you're doing photography now, how like how much of that was developed within the Topo side of things, and how much of that had you tried to do on your own beforehand?
Yeah, so before I started shooting photos in high school more seriously, it took a couple of years of classes and courses, and started getting some what at the time was nicer cameras. Looking back, it's nothing fancy, but yeah, when I was at Topo, I was shooting photos mostly because I wanted to capture memories from different adventures and I'd go out on the weekends, whether it was climbing or camping or hiking or just being with my dogs and family and stuff, and wanted to kind of capture those moments and shoot for myself. And you know, it was also the time where social media was really starting to spike heavily. And so Topo was one of the first kind of smaller outdoor brands that had a social media following that was starting to blow up and just get a lot of attention. And they quickly realized like we could use all the content possible. So if anyone has anything, please feel free to share it. And so, you know, it'd be the typical weekend, go outside, adventure in the mountains, come back with some photos, share it with the team and say, if there's anything usable here, feel free. And I wasn't trying to take it seriously as far as a career or profession goes. So I didn't care that they were using it. I was just like, I'd rather it get used and not sit, you know, on a hard drive. And obviously, and you know, so they started posting content. And one day I got a email from Chaco Sandals, and they like, hey, we reached out to the Topo team and asked who is shooting some of this stuff, and they sent us to you. So here we are. And basically, Chaco asked me to shoot a campaign with my 2 dogs, and it was a dog campaign with some boots and some sandals, and it was mostly dog collars. It was mostly dog products like leashes and collars that they were doing with their webbing. And so they just asked me what my day rate was and if I wanted to shoot this campaign. And I that was my first client ever. I'd never charged anybody before. So yeah, that was my first. So yeah, it was sort of via Topo, but not necessarily via Topo. Like what my time at Topo, I wasn't, besides letting them use some photos, I was the retail store manager and helped a lot on kind of warehouse stuff. And so, I mean, it was early days, so we all saw each other every day, all day, and were kind of involved in, you would hear about everything that was happening, but my role was not particularly in a quote unquote creative role. But yeah, so after Chaco, I sort of realized like, hey, people are willing to pay me for my work. And at the time I didn't think about it as work. I just thought people are willing to maybe pay me for shooting photos when I'm outside, which is what I love doing. And so I continued. At that point, I started to do a lot of the good old like trading product for photography. And, you know, especially at that time, if you caught it at the right wave, it was a great time to get involved with different brands and a great way to, it was before like brands really had dialed in ambassador programs and what influencer marketing would truly look like and seeding product for exchange of content. So not that I caught it at the like beginning, but I did catch it at a good time and was able to connect with a lot of young brands like Rumple or Forsake Shoes and just a bunch of smaller brands that ended up kind of growing pretty quickly. And so they started using my content, and little by little, some people would pay me, or I'd ask either for more product or if they could pay me, or I was like, hey, I don't need more shoes or more hammocks. Like maybe you could cut me a check this time. And so it was never like quite hard feelings. It was just like at some point it got old getting just products. So I started to develop, you know, a way to charge. And I never knew what I was really doing though. Like I had some really good friends who would kind of coach me on pricing, but not, it's different for everybody and every project's different. So it's sort of hard to really find your path. But yeah, I ended up leaving Topo, went to go work at a tech startup in Boulder, Colorado, as a creative producer and project manager there. And it was really cool. I learned a lot about moving at a really fast pace as far as product goes, which is hard to do with physical products, especially ones that are seasonal. And so, yeah, I just got to see what it looks like to build products really fast. And tech world, it's not for everybody, but I sort of feel like if you ever get a chance to spend some time in tech, it's probably a good thing because there's a lot to learn about from the tech industry and a lot of really good folks there.
Yeah, I think it really helps you appreciate like how things are done in other industries too.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's a great way to like push yourself and go do something that is not you know, it's new. It was new for me. I never worked on a product that big, and especially on the tech side of things. And I just got to work with some crazy talented individuals who taught me a lot. And my role there was also heavily involved in user research. And so I got to understand what it's like to empathize with the end user and with users of the product, and how that impacts the design of products. And you know, you can take that into any field, whether it's like outdoor products and you're testing a jacket versus a tech product. Like, knowing how to understand and empathize with the end user is an amazing skill set. So yeah.
Yeah. So what was it like throughout that whole period? Because it seems like there's just so much learning coming at you so fast, you know, like all of a sudden you're thrown into like doing photography more. You're trying to learn how to handle client relationships, how to handle billing, and then you're transitioning into this new job that's like more fast paced. What was, you know, did it feel like that much chaos when you were in the middle of all of it?
Uh, I wouldn't say it felt like chaos. It was it was maybe more just sort of confusion of like, um, yeah, it was definitely chaotic, but it was more of just trying to figure out like how is this going to impact me in 5 years? I always try and think a little longer term than 6 months out. And yeah, I definitely did have some really good kind of coaches and mentors and people who continue to really help me out. I mean, during that time, like Hunter Lawrence, he's a photographer who's Denver based, and a lot of people know him for Aspen the Mountain Pup, and he's done some amazing, cool work. And Hunter was a person who I'd call a lot and just ask like, how much should I charge for this? Or like, how do you put an invoice together, and all these different things. And Levi T. Arena, who I work with now on the podcast and some other projects, like Levi was someone I'd call for camera equipment, or just, yeah, I'd find different people. I always look for whoever's crushing it in different fields, and or they're experts, even if it's an expert in just lighting. It's like, hey, I'm gonna ask them some questions. So yeah, I was definitely had a bunch of people who I could reach out to. And overall, I'd say like Mark Hansen from Topo, he and I continue to be really good friends, and to this day. But even at that point, he was coaching me on a lot of this, as far as like, how should I view my career as a whole. So yeah, ultimately I ended up leaving the tech company to work full time as a freelancer for like 4 or 5 months. And during that time, Rav Equipment, which is another outerwear company, super technical as far as product goes, and pretty high end outdoor gear. I was starting to do some small work for them as like an ambassador and some photo shoots and things like that. And they were going to open a flagship store, and they knew I had a retail background in outdoor industry. They knew I could do some photo shoots. So they kind of like combined all the skill sets and asked me to go manage their flagship store. So that kind of took me all the way back into the outdoor industry.
That's interesting. How much of that did you kind of push your way into via like some opportunities that showed up, and how much was it more of an outside influence? Because it seems like throughout a lot of those moves, they kind of just like presented themselves, and then you were like, all right, let's do this, and you know, stepped into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting. Actually, right before I left the tech company, Chris Burkard had reached out to me and asked if I was interested in helping run some things with him, as far as like kind of helping operate his studio and some stuff. And we had a couple phone calls about it, and I ultimately decided it wasn't for me before we got too serious into the discussion. Also, like, loved Denver and wasn't at the time super interested in California, but yeah, it was so that was a kind of big turning point. It was super big honor to have Chris Burkard reach out and ask if I was interested in kind of helping run his studio. But it was also like, hey, it was a good taking myself a little more serious and realizing like maybe I can do this. And so that's why I also did made the jump into freelance work. And so that one was a little more outside influence as far as people kind of pushing me through conversations. I was just asking people like, should I consider that, and what would that look like, and all these things, and people pushing me a little bit to do my own thing. And then when I was a freelancer, Rab approached me, and that was a little bit more them kind of coming after me. And I really enjoyed working with people and stuff. So it was a good opportunity, and their flagship store is down the street from where I live in Denver. So it was pretty good fit, pretty easy. So yeah,
That's
that was
awesome.
kind of like stuff.
I was gonna ask too. It's a little bit off topic, but not quite. What has it been like seeing not just Denver, but kind of like the outside of Denver, like Colorado and Boulder, as a whole, change over the last few years? Because I've had a couple friends there, and it seems like I've talked about this with a couple people. Every year that I end up being there, it seems like almost a completely different place from the year before.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's really exciting. I think the more that comes here and the more the city grows, the more opportunity there sort of is. Especially, I mean, for me, I've been here for 6 years. If you came now, it might be a little overwhelming depending on where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's probably, if I moved to New York City, probably be very overwhelming. So I guess it depends on where you're moving from and the scale of the city you're in. But for me, I get excited about it. It's more people here who I could potentially collaborate with, or more brands that I can just walk over and knock on their doors, and it's a little bit easier for me. But yeah, I'm excited about it. I think as long as hopefully we can respect the city's heritage and what it is, and we don't completely change it. One of my clients, the Ramble Hotel in Denver, that hotel was specifically designed in such a way that it could be timeless. And I was talking to the owner a lot about the neighborhood and Denver in general. And right now, Denver's sort of like the wild, wild west, where there's plenty of opportunity to develop. And so he's just hoping that people come and don't make the city, at least physically and visually, something where in 20, 30 years, people come by and they're like, what happened to Denver? Like, because there's honestly, as far as I know, not a ton of like design codes, and it's sort of free for all as far as like what you want to do. And so you can be driving in a neighborhood and see a pretty old historic home, and then see a house that is insanely modern and totally contrasts against each other. And so, yeah, there's some things where I wish maybe the city, I guess, would have a little more control on.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's neighborhoods where you just see houses and you're like, who allowed that house to go up?
Well, yeah, there's interesting because some cities have that. I think it's a code where you can't build over a certain height or something. And I feel like typically it's a lot of it has to do with the capital, or like some building that's already at a height that they, deem as the highest, because they don't want all this other extra crap coming in and kind of overshadowing the rest of what's going on.
Right. Yeah, but overall, I'm excited. There's a really great community here, and I think overall the community, at least the one I'm in, and my friend group, they're super supportive of people trying new things, and yeah, it's fun.
It's cool. I think there's kind of that group of people that grew up in Colorado or in Denver, and I think it's like this in a lot of cities where it's the locals only kind of vibe, and they push people away. And there was a good portion of that when I was still in Portland, and it's just something interesting to kind of pay attention to over time with different cities, is how that ends up changing as more people come in, because there's so much of an influx that it kind of overwhelms the culture that was there before it. But it definitely seems like there's a good handful of people in Denver that are willing to kind of extend their hand to newcomers and be like, this is how we want this city to be, which is really cool. Because I think in some other cities that didn't necessarily have that, they're kind of seeing a different change happen over time.
Yeah, for sure.
But that's interesting that you were talking about the Chris Burkard thing. Like, that's definitely got to be something that validates what you're doing when you're getting a bigger name like that, reaching out to you to talk business. I think it's also cool that you mentioned having some people to reach out to bounce, ideas or opportunities off of, just because I think, there's certain things that if you're not ready for all of what a decision would entail, it's difficult to make a choice of whether or not you want to step into it, because you can't really tell, like you were saying earlier, 5 years down the line or whatever, what is this going to look like if I choose this and stick with it, especially when you're moving from Denver to California, where it's just a completely different deal.
Yeah. I'm sure I would have been successful working for Chris or under Chris, and it just would have looked very different. And I'm thankful for the way my journey's turned out. So
totally, that's cool. So then you ended up after the tech thing. What ended up happening after that? You said you started to get into more of the freelance side of things with photography and just connecting with more brands.
Yeah. So during the tech thing, tech company in that phase, I continued to freelance. A lot of it was still like super small scale projects and stuff, and ended up moving over to Rab. And from Rab, I don't know, it was like 4 or 5 months in, they kind of moved me over to the marketing team. And that's where I really got to grow as kind of a marketer as well. And so my role there was a lot of like planning all of Outdoor Retailer, and or working on it with my boss at the time. And so a lot of event-based marketing and trade shows, and got to learn that entire world. And when you're on the brand side of things and understanding how trade shows work, now I can walk the show, and it's a different feeling when you've been the person on the behind the scenes, and you just, before I was actually, my first time to Outdoor Retailer was with Rab, and it was on the brand side of things. And so had I gone completely as a freelancer for my first time and photographer and walked up to a booth, I would have probably been completely overwhelmed. But getting to spend a year on the brand side and seeing trade shows happen from the brand side, it kind of completely changes things. Got to meet a lot of amazing people. I think the coolest part was I got to help manage the athlete team, and just got really close to a couple athletes there. And Rab has some of the best athletes. Like, Jeff Shapiro is one of the guys I got pretty close to during my time there. And the dude's a base jumper, wingsuit pilot, paraglide. He can ski pretty great stuff, and he can paddle down like class 4, just master
skilled, just everything.
Like, master falconeer. Like, dude can skate, he can mountain bike, he can trail run. You're just like, what? How did you do that?
Did you ever get roped into any crazy experiences with any of those athletes?
I mean, not like too crazy. I got to go ice climbing or rock climbing with a lot of them. And with Jeff Shapiro, I did go up to Missoula for a couple days with him, and got to watch him paraglide and do some cool stuff, and got to see him with his falcon, which is hilarious. Like, he wakes up and he has his falcon. He gets his falcon out of it's this huge room. It's not even fair to call it a cage. It's a room, but he just wakes up and has time with his falcon, like just on a rocking chair, drinking coffee and a falcon in his hand.
You meet some really interesting people, that's for sure. And it's funny because I think the first time you meet some of those people, you're like, whoa, they're pretty out there. And then the more you spend time with them, you're like, okay, I get the thinking, but at the same time, I don't think I'd wake up and have coffee with my falcon.
Yeah, it's hilarious how normal all of it is to him. But yeah, I got to spend time like rock climbing and ice climbing with a lot of them, and just gotta. I mean, Rab. During my time there, I took a month off and went to Nepal, and didn't do anything crazy serious. I just went up to Everest Base Camp and hung out. But it was a really amazing like cultural experience, and really cool to just experience Nepal for an entire month. And I went on some other really fun adventures during my time at Rab. A lot of it like completely unaffiliated, and trips that definitely grew me as a photographer as well. And I mean, during my time there, I got a couple like features with Climbing Magazine, and because I had photos of some of our athletes, they got used in like where had I not been able to those athletes, you know, I may not have gotten some of those features. So there's some really cool perks like that as well, and things that kind of help grow me and my name as a photographer. So super excited and thankful for that time. Yeah, ended up continuing to like grow the whole photographer thing. And I mean, during my time too at RAV, like I got to shoot for Toyota as well. It was a regional project, but got Toyota like under my belt. I shot still photography during a TV commercial, and so started to get bigger clients as well during that time.
That's awesome that it all kind of started feeding into itself. What was it like trying to balance what may have been like conflicting things? Like you're out there trying to enjoy being in a certain environment or paying attention to more of your surroundings, but you're also trying to work in enough of an ability to take photographs at the same time, and you know, whatever technical processes take place while you're trying to, you know, like handle files and potentially send them off to other people. Like, and then just in general, what was it like going to Nepal and then coming back? Was there any sort of like transition period that you had? Did it feel that culturally different?
Yeah, so with the first question, you're sort of asking like balancing photography and the outdoors and sort of like trying to keep up on different things. And yeah, for me, I don't know, there's just a handful of people who could probably do well at the highest level, right? You have like your Jimmy Chins or your Renan Osirk or yeah, there's more, but you get what I'm saying. There's like just a handful. There's probably 10 people out there who are performing at a super insanely high level as an athlete, but also as content individuals. So call that photography, video, whatever it is. There's definitely more. I know I'm leaving a lot of people out, but I'm trying to say that like at some point, at least for me, so I didn't get started in any real outdoor stuff until, I mean, really my 20s. Like I didn't start climbing until maybe 5 years ago. And I just had to choose, like, I know I'm not going to be the best climber. But if there's whatever I can do to try and keep up with people, like I'll do that. But I have to pick and choose. I also didn't start shooting super seriously till I was, you know, in my 20s as well. And so, especially on the climbing side, like you can get good for sure, but you're not, if you didn't start climbing as a kid, you're not going to be climbing the world and all this stuff. And there's definitely some people who can develop fast. And, you know, I'm saying some pretty broad statements. I'm not trying to leave people out or say that people haven't done that, but at least in my personal journey, I knew I had to decide, do I want to be the best photographer I can, or do I want to be the best adventurer, you know, that I can? And I think you could do both well, but ultimately, for me, photography was what I really wanted to choose. And yeah, I mean, there's some fun examples of like going rafting with camera gear, and like we were on pack rafts, and I didn't know how. I was definitely in water that was like not water I should be in, and level, and like taking cameras out and then getting caught in the raft about it, like it flipped, and trying to get the camera into the dry bag and roll it up before I sink and tie it up. But yeah, for me, ultimately, it came down to like, you got to pick and choose. And as much as I love the outdoors and I want the outdoors and adventure to always be a part of my career in some sort of way, ultimately, I knew I had to develop a skill set that would really impact my career. And for me, photography and content and like developing ultimately as a storyteller and like every skill set involved in telling better stories, to me, that was more important in the grand scheme of my career, versus, you know, it's like, cool, I can climb. I don't know, the hardest I probably ever climbed was like 5'11", maybe like one pitch of a 5'12" at most, if ever. And that's like barely
right there with you.
And that was maybe like one day at the most peak of my climbing career. So, right, it's like, cool, you climb 5'11", you're not making a career out of this.
Well,
And
that's
so
kind of where you start to get puckered a little too. Like when you're outside and you're doing more multi-pitch stuff, that's kind of like the level where it, at least for me, it started to seem like it was getting a little past where I was like cool with it. Cause then it was like, now you're starting to take risks. You're getting out on some things where you're like, you're just a little more scared than, than you were at the beginning. And you get to a point where you're kind of like, okay, I got it.
yeah, yeah, that's sort of like in my little path with um, yeah, and it's cool. I still shoot with like Chaco right now. I'm an ambassador with Chaco sandals, and I get to do a lot of outside things with them and get to be outside a lot and kind of go on some adventures. And I'm heading down to the Caribbean on Friday to go shoot some catalog stuff for a really cool brand that we can't really talk about right now, but like I still get to go on some fun adventures, like 8 days in the Caribbean for an outdoor brand. Like some people would be like, oh my gosh, you're so soft these days. Like you used to climb and be outside and do all this cool stuff, and now you just go chill in the Caribbean. And it's like, so what? I'm outside.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think I definitely battled for a while with like wanting to be a much better adventurer or athlete. An athlete's such a, I don't like necessarily using that term, but for a while I definitely wanted to be more that, and then just have to kind of like come to terms with like, all right, I'm in my mid 20s. I'm not gonna be Jimmy Chin as far like as from a climbing perspective or
Mm-hmm.
from an outdoor perspective. And so, yeah, I mean, these days I'm like super comfortable with who I am and what I'm doing and super proud of it. But I think too, working at Rab, because there's such a, all the people involved as far as like the athlete team goes, they're all just doing some amazing stuff. And you're like, oh my gosh, here I am climbing the Flatirons in Boulder and I think I'm cool. But like these guys are, you know, putting first ascents up in India and all over the world and coming back and sharing these stories. And I think too, for me, when I was at Rab, so I was in charge of like the social media for North America and really helping kind of find stories with it from our athletes. And so you see all the stuff they're doing, and it's easy to just think you're in no way cool. And you know, at the end of the day, everyone has a cool story. It's just different.
Mm-hmm. So what at what point did you kind of come to the understanding that you wanted to be a little bit more rounded out in terms of like the athlete versus the kind of like creative content side of things? Because it seems like you had more of an understanding of like, I'm going to get to this level with this thing, and then when I hit a certain point and I understand enough about it, I'm going to kind of go over and do this other thing. And you have all these little bits and pieces of all these different things that you can pull together knowledge from. But it seems like you went about that in more of a logical way than most people would, where they kind of go all into one thing for a really long time and then hit a wall like, oh shit, this isn't what I want to do. How do I switch gears? You kind of like tiptoed into a bunch of little ones and then mashed it all together. Like, was that your plan from the beginning, or did you have a couple people that you could kind of bounce that thought process out on, or how did that end up coming about?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of, I'm always trying to like analyze myself, probably
Mm-hmm.
maybe too much, but just trying to figure out like what am I doing now, like today and tomorrow and this week that's going to impact, you know, what am I doing like today that's going to impact 6 months, and what am I doing this year that's going to impact like 3 years and 5 years. And so I'm always like trying to study my own landscape as far as like my life goes. And that's where, yeah, I was just analyzing like, okay, I'm not, you know, I'm not developing as fast as some of my friends. So maybe naturally, like I'm not going to be the craziest. So, okay, I'll backtrack. A lot of it is like for practical as far as like making a living goes, right? It's to make a living as an outdoor photographer is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
By that, what I mean is you got to be finding some insane stories to tell, or you just kind of caught the wave at the right time. And so when I was at Rab, I would get pitched like 20, 30 people a day. I mean, it was just like
Wow.
people emailing into Rab's, just like info@rab.com or whatever I forgot now, but like whatever the generic email is, people just be like, you'd get these photographers who say, hey, I'm going down to South America, I'm going to go climb this peak, and do you want, and if you give me some product, I'll come back with some photos. And I'll be like, oh, actually, like last month someone already climbed that. And or someone tells you like, hey, I'm going to go climb this, or I'm going to go on this adventure or whatever, and I'm going to spend a month in New Zealand. Do you need content from there? And you just sort of realize, like, when I was in the position of getting like 20 emails a day from people wanting to work with the brand, I was just sort of came to realization that I think there's definitely still ways to make a living in that space of like adventure outdoor photography for sure. But I sort of just wanted to find a different way. And like the clear path, like if you're an athlete doing unbelievable stuff, then there's a way. But what I realized being at RAB is going and climbing Mount Rainier is not unique in any sort of way, or going and spending a month in New Zealand is not unique anymore. Like, give me a story. Going to New Zealand for a month is not a story. Climbing Mount Rainier is not a story per se. Like, there's stories that you can develop from that. But yeah, it was a little bit of like burnout from being on the other side of like constantly just having people ask for product or ask for money or support my trip. I'm going to do this. And me doing that to other brands too. I mean, I was in that same bucket of like pitching my friends and being like, oh, I'm going to go do this. And they're like, yeah, that's cool. I mean, and so also just realizing practically how things work and how brands work and how marketing budgets gets divided and used and all that. Being on the back end is like probably the best thing I ever did. You know, and it was during a time period where a lot of my friends were quitting their jobs and buying vans and living out of their vans and doing all this cool stuff. And there's just part of me that's like, I kind of want to put my time in and learn a little bit more before I totally just try and do this on my own. And that's probably the best thing I did. So I know that was a very long answer to your question, and I don't even know if I truly answered.
That was a wonderful answer. And yeah, I came to kind of a similar conclusion myself several years ago when I had followed not necessarily like a similar trajectory as yours, but I think I followed a similar thought process of like, I want to get into this more. But it was like, I think around a similar time where like the van life thing had kind of started to blow up, and it was like, okay, clearly it's going to be really difficult to actually make a living doing something like that, and it's not going to last long. So what do I need to learn, and how do I need to learn it in order to make sure that I can like continue being around this, but in a way where I'm really living the life that I want to live, and also being able to live it longer? Because the worst thing that I think could happen is you get into that thing, you have a couple moments of like, wow, this is it, star shines, burns off, and then, you know, you're done and you're like, damn, that was quick.
Yeah. So yeah, that was sort of my realization. But yeah, and little by little during that entire time, I just had, you know, bigger projects and more freelance work. And so I'm glad I put my time in at different companies and got to really learn what it's like on the other side. And I'm still young. I'm not saying I won't have another like job for a different company. But right now I'm enjoying like working for myself and with a bunch of different brands. But I'm glad I put my time in and really learned. And it was really cool. I mean, it was a lot of long nights and using up all my vacation time to go do projects. But I'm glad I like did them both at the same time, because if I hadn't done any freelance and just quit my full-time job and tried to learn freelance then, or try to learn how to do my own thing, like that would have been rough too. So yeah, it was, you know, I could argue that like I wish I would have done it when all my friends were quitting their jobs and buying vans and Tacomas and hitting the road and stuff. But yeah, I'm glad I kind of like put my time in a little bit longer. So
yeah, agreed. So can you talk to me a little bit more about what it was like on both sides of that experience? Because there's got to be learnings that you can pull from, you know, with having been involved with more of these brands and understanding how you can use that as a photographer to kind of get more things that they would need, or potentially work around some like red tape or processes that I think a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of when they go into it. But also What was that like, being inundated with that many people trying to pitch you stories? Like, were there specific things that you ended up looking for more often, or things that you kind of looked at like, oh, this is something that someone says to me literally every day?
Yeah, I mean, for me, you know, on being on the brand side, like you start to realize like, oh, that's how catalogs get put together. And so then I learned like, oh, if I'm going to pitch somebody, like be a little more clear show them where this stuff could be used. And so like, if you hit me up at the right time and we're putting our catalog together or something, and we happen to need photos from a certain place and it all comes together, then sure, we might, you know, send you some product or hire you or give you some, you know, give you a budget to go shoot or whatever. So you learn things like that, or you learn even things about trade show booths and the way, like the kind of photos that most companies are using in trade show booths. And so, I mean, it's basic stuff like that, right? Like you learn about sales meetings and the kind of things that companies might need for sales meetings. And you learn a lot. And that's what I was taking away, was where content needed to be used. And I mean, running the social media too, you kind of realize like, I think what my ultimate takeaway was learning how content gets used on the brand side of things, on the company side. And so it helped me on the freelance side be able to pitch better. And when I'm putting a deck together to pitch an idea, it's like, oh, I have an idea of the stories you might want and where it can get used, so I can give you examples and all that stuff. So it was really cool to just try and put both of those pieces together. So
that's super smart. And I think it's interesting because it seems like that's, you know, a completely different approach than things that we've gotten, where someone's, you know, like cold sent us a deck of like, oh, we're going to go shoot this thing. Do you need photos? And they end up spelling your company name wrong on the front of the deck. And you're like, okay, you know, clearly you didn't dig into that too much to try and send this. So it doesn't mean too much.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I mean, from a networking perspective, it was the best thing for me as far as like working at different companies, just the people you get to meet, from athletes to brand ambassadors to other marketing teams that you're collaborating with, or editorial teams. Like when you're on the brand side of things, you know, at Rab, I'd get to watch my boss, the way he would buy ads in different magazines. Like he sits right next to me. I get to ask him like, why are you buying an ad here, or why not here? Or I get to watch him physically on the computer design the ad and ask him like, oh, why did you choose that photo versus this one? And all these different things. And you just like, that is like that's better than going to college. You get to watch it being done. Like when you get to watch the ad spend happen in front of you, that's, you know, yeah, that, I don't know, it doesn't get better than that. And so you get to see why catalogs are made a certain way. And yeah, I mean, everything I basically just mentioned, but to me, that was better than going to college. So
yeah, well, and you don't have to pay for it. You're getting paid for it. It's the exact opposite.
Yeah. So
that's super cool. So then how did that end up transitioning into the Keys podcast and all that went into that? Because like what I was interested in when I had just briefly seen your background was like, dang, you went from, you know, being a store manager to being a marketing manager to being a photographer. And it's just like, you're gaining all these little tidbits of like how a business works. And now all of a sudden it seems like, at least on paper, a full 360 into like just a completely different thing. But like, obviously being able to talk to you more, it makes so much more sense.
Yeah. And I mean, it seemed like career wise, yeah, it's been a 360. But the main theme's just been people. Like that's ultimately everything to me just boils down to the people I'm involved with and the people I get to be around, and the people that pour into me like that. I owe a lot to a lot of people. And basically every jump I've done there's been like at least one, but probably a handful of people that were involved in the process. And so with the Keys podcast, I mean, my photography career has just developed primarily through relationships. Like At this point, I feel a lot more confident as a photographer and creative person in general. Like you would have asked me a year and a half ago, and I would have doubted myself a lot. And now I trust a lot more. I can capture what people need, and yeah, I feel like a lot stronger as a creative and photographer, storyteller, and all that. But the theme has just been people, really, and relationships, and people who have really taken a risk to give me a new position or bring me on into a project that is a little bit maybe above what I was capable of. They just gave me the shot, and when someone gives you an opportunity, you got to perform. And yeah, that is ultimately what led to the podcast as well. So all the way, I mean, going back to like college, I was working at Starbucks, and I had, I just really cared about the people. That sounds cheesy, but to me, I was like, I could either treat this as like a shitty college job, or I can look at this. We had a lot of regular customers, and I told myself, I have 2 minutes every day to pour them a cup of coffee and just talk to them really quick. And if I can impact their day in a positive way, hopefully that, I did something really good there. And hopefully that made their transaction a lot more worth it. Because I don't know, some people like Starbucks for sure, but I don't think Starbucks is the best. And a lot of people, whatever, we could argue a whole different thing. But ultimately, to me, I was like, I think these people are paying. And what's true to Starbucks as a company is that it's more about the experience. And I told myself, yeah, I got 2 minutes to talk to the same person who I see every day before they go to work. And I have like countless examples of people who like just connected with me in a crazy way. But this one guy, Matt McClellan, he would come through every morning, and I just got to know him, and he gave me his business card, said he wanted to hire me one day. And I thought he was kidding because he worked at this hotel development company. And I was like, there's no way, why would he ever hire me? But he gave me his business card. And months later, he ended up reaching back out and said, hey, kid, come. He still calls me kid. We're still in touch. He's like, come by my office. I'm going to talk to you about some stuff. And he ended up offering me a job as a project manager for the president of architecture at this development company. And he's like, I'll give you 3 months on the job, and if it works, I'll keep you. If not, like, you're gone. You can go back to Starbucks. And yeah, 3 months went by, and he kept me around, and he taught me everything I knew about that job, and really just poured a lot into me, really developed and mentored me. And basically, I mean, same thing with Mark Hansen at Topo. Like, I met Mark at a party, at this Topo store, Topo Holly Brothers party that I show up to, and pours me a shot of whiskey, says, hey, you should work for me. And we're still really good friends. And he's still one of my biggest mentors. And basically just along the way, a lot of people they've taken a risk on me, but also just poured into me and done a lot for me. And I could just keep the examples coming, but I felt like I've been just given a lot of good, and a lot of people have poured into me, and the podcast was sort of an outlet to hopefully give back in some sort of way. And the goal with our podcast, with the Keys podcast, is to interview people who are behind the scenes at different companies doing some really cool stuff, and hopefully someone listens to it. And we interview a lot of creative folks because that's the world kind of I come from. But example, tomorrow or the next day, we'll release an episode with Sam, who's the senior product design lead at Squarespace. And maybe there's a college student who's trying to figure out, like, oh, how in the world do you end up working at Squarespace? How do you grow as a designer or product lead? Like, what does that job even look like? How do you get there? Because on paper, if you look at Sam's resume, you're like, I mean, I get it how she got there, but like, I don't really get how she got there. And so hopefully someone listens to our episode and can take something away. And I'm starting to do some bonus episodes where I'm trying to really extract some more practical wisdom that I'm learning from all the guests and give that wisdom back. And, it's this free thing where at least for the audience, it's free. But hopefully like someone listens to it and they're just like, oh yeah, that's how like that person got there, and like take something away from it. And And ultimately, yeah, I can find some more tangible ways in the future to make the podcast, just more tangible with advice and wisdom, and do different things to you. But yeah, that's why it really started.
That's awesome. Well, I think it's interesting too. Like that's kind of why I wanted to have you on, and it's cool to hear that that's why you want to have other people on your show too. Is just because it seems like there's so much information that people can gain just from hearing someone's story. Whether or not you're telling people how you went about doing it, it's just cool to hear, what each step looked like along the way, and kind of how you ended up looking at different opportunities that were presented to you.
Yeah. That, and like also being at different companies, and here, I like to read a lot of like books on entrepreneurship and startups and biographies about founders, and there's plenty of content too. Like there's podcasts about founders for days. There's startup podcasts for days. A lot of them are super focused on the founders of companies, and that's great. Like I'm not trying to knock founders in any way. They put all the hard work in the beginning and come up with the initial ideas and all that, but great companies don't become great without the people behind them. And a lot of times those people's stories don't get told. So the Keys podcast is all these key players behind the scenes who really make these companies great. Like, you think about Squarespace, and you think about the founders, like, yeah, there's one founder, but there's 1,000 people that work there now. And if Squarespace is going to be around in 100 years, it'll be because of all those people and the founder as well, but all those people too. And so my goal is to just try and find, I think the hardest part is like, there's so many good people, like at Squarespace, how do I choose like one person for my podcast when there's a lot of them?
But that's almost what the best thing is that there's more people that they can connect you with that you can then talk to afterwards, and you can kind of start to see, how these pieces are coming together.
Yeah. So yeah, it's been cool.
How so that was that was going to be my other question, was how did you end up coming up with the name The Keys? But it made sense after you kind of explained it right there.
Yeah, it was actually, I was venting to Mark Hansen from Topo, and as I do a lot of times, I was just like
with whiskey.
I'm so frustrated with all these podcasts and books. Like everything's about the founder. You're a founder, but like Topo's not just because of you and Jed. Like there's so many more people. Like all these people are key players, and their stories don't get told. Yeah, I was just venting, and at some point I dropped like, these people are like key players, and he's like, stop venting and start a podcast. Like stop talking and start doing. And he's the one, like, I wish I still had the text. I think it was just on an old phone or something, but he was like, stop thinking about it, stop venting, just start a podcast. You already have the name. It's the Keys podcast because key players. And I was like, oh yeah, all right. And then I said something like, oh, I got to research about podcasting and how to do it. And he's like, stop researching, just start doing it. You got to stop thinking and stop researching. And yeah, so that's sort of how the name came about. And yeah, it was also like, the more as I began the journey, I just asked a couple people who I thought were like really influential at different companies what their stories really were. Mm-hmm. I remember my friend Roberto, who's the second episode, we sat down for coffee, and it was supposed to be like an hour meeting. And 2.5 hours later, I was like, oh shit, I'm late to work. And it's because his story was so fascinating. And I remember asking him who's shared your story in detail? And he's like, no. And like, why would someone share this? And mm-hmm. I was like, are you kidding me? This story is amazing. You have an amazing story. And so, yeah, through talking to a couple people, I was just like, oh, your story's got to get told somehow.
Yeah.
So hopefully I'm doing a good job at sharing them and telling their stories. But yeah.
There's so many little intricacies too that I think it's interesting to think about how you can have someone on for like an hour and a half or whatever and get through all these crazy things about their life. But then to think about the fact that that hour and a half was just to bring someone up to speed on like the high level, and that beyond there's all these tiny little things that they're forgetting about that are, little pieces of how certain things happened, or just like funny little asides, and like, those stories are absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
So what was it like taking the actual first step into doing it? Like, so you're mentioning the fact that, yeah, that you were told, you know, stop researching it and just do it. What was the first step of just do it?
Yeah, so I was at a bar with my friend Levi, and he and I for years, Levi's a photographer, and for years we and we're just sitting at this bar, and he was running. A lot of his work is primarily like in the wedding industry, and he's a really talented photographer. And he was running a really like organic podcast, like hardly any editing at all, super raw audio, all this stuff. But he was just running this podcast with his friend, who's another photographer, and they would just talk about like the wedding industry and all this stuff. And I just asked him about podcasting and what equipment they're using and all sorts of stuff. And I was like, hey, I have this idea for a podcast, and kind of threw the idea at him. And he's like, if I help you do this, will you really do it? And I was like, yeah, for sure. And so we just kind of did it, or just started to do it. I mean, it's funny, we actually have them right here, because I still use them, just not for podcasting, but we bought these like tiny DR10s. Oh, nice. And our first 2-3 podcasts we did were with these tiny DR10s. They record straight onto memory cards, and they're actually great if you know where to place them and you're in the situation. And oftentimes we just didn't know what we were doing. We actually, from the get-go, though, from the start, we thought, we knew we wanted to try and produce something higher quality, and had kind of a pretty big vision for it. And I mean, we were willing to spend quite a bit of money out of our own pocket to try and do this thing. So we started with that, mostly because we just didn't really know any better. And we reached out to our friend Marco, who's now kind of our audio engineer, and we just asked him like, hey, what do you think we should be using? So he started us with these guys, with these DR10s. Or no, we started on our own. And then we also didn't really know what we were doing as far as like mixing audio, cutting things, like really, or adding music or any of that. And so I was trying to do as much YouTube tutorials, and I was like, I think I'm pretty okay at this thing. And then we had him cut our first like couple episodes, and we're like, oh, this is why this is why you work with experts, because they know what they're doing. And yeah, so we moved from that to, I don't think I have one in here, but we had these Blue Yeti microphones, which are super popular in podcasting. And then we upgraded from that to Rode mics, and an entire, like basically our entire setup now is Rode equipment. And yeah, it's been interesting because for our podcast, we 100% of the guests we have traveled to. And so we needed a setup that could be basically as high quality, but also very mobile, which it's been a fun challenge. And, you know, Levi takes a lot of the lead as far as like equipment goes. And so he could speak to like the detail of it, but yeah, it's Rode equipment. It's all great stuff. Like I love it. And I can throw it all into like a backpack, which is sweet, and travel. So we have enough of a setup to do 3 people. We'll probably add maybe another mic so we could have 4 people in the future. But yeah, we're starting to do some fun stuff with it. But that was like the first step, was like just start somewhere. And those DR10s, like if you're trying to start a podcast, like there's some cheap equipment out there, and you don't have to start with expensive stuff. And we scaled as the podcast became a little more serious. We like scaled the equipment. And yeah, I just started reaching out. I started with friends that I thought had amazing stories, and I knew personally, so I could connect with them quicker. And as that developed, I used a lot of like my photography contacts in that world to just start reaching out to individuals and tell them about this new project. And at first it was scary, because you're like, I don't really
put yourself out there.
A whole new creative project that I might completely suck at. And this might change the way you view me as a creator. I have a good relationship with you as a photographer, and hopefully this doesn't ruin everything. But do you want to be on my podcast?
Well, it's so funny because I think coming from that like marketing creative side of things, you're so used to like trying to polish everything up, and I think there's like a piece of that where you put out the crude, raw, kind of uncut thing, and there's a piece of you that's like, fuck, there needs to be, you know, I need to put this together a little bit better somehow.
Yeah. Oh man, I still have those moments though. The other day I was recording in New York with a guest that I don't want to drop yet, but also and an editor, and the entire time I was like, oh my god, I suck so bad. Like my journalism skills suck. I was like, oh, this is the worst. And it wasn't at all. I was just like, when you meet someone who's really good at what you're trying to do and you're so early on, you're just like, yeah. I mean, I listen to Joe Rogan sometimes. I'm like, why in the world do I still do this? It's so good. And then I have to remember, like, oh yeah, remember Fear Factor? He spent years on TV. Like, this guy knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like back to my early days of photography of like, I had to learn how to invoice and how to client manage and how to upgrade camera gear and find good camera gear and, you know, all those things that I didn't know in photography. It's a little bit of the same way in podcasting. I mean, luckily I'm at a point where I can work with some amazing people who are good at certain things. And sort of my goal with the podcast is to focus on the interviewing and the guests and all that. So I'm going to stay away from trying to be an expert on the audio side of things.
Probably a college degree.
Yeah. I'm like, there's people who go to college for audio. I'm just going to let them, you know, do their thing.
Handle that. That makes sense. Yeah. So how did you get into the point of it where you decided like, we're going to go travel to these places to actually interview them? Because I think that's a very interesting take or approach on the podcast side of things, because it's so easy to either use video chats like we're doing right now, or with like what you just mentioned with Joe Rogan. He's got a studio in LA, which is just obviously like a hub for most people when they're traveling, so it's a little easier for him to get people on. But with you have to go out and bring all this gear to a spot, and then you have to show up, get all these things set up, and like, you know, that's just a lot higher of a production than I think most people are used to doing with podcasts. What made you want to go that route?
Yeah, so I mean, it did start. I think there's ways to have high quality with remote. I think what you're doing right now is a great way of doing it as high quality as possible while being remote. I've seen some other setups where it's literally just like Skype and basically you're recording the screen and stuff like that. So props to you for doing it high quality while still being remote.
Well, hey, I tried, but at the same time, you still have what happened earlier, which happens multiple times, and Google decides to throw you a curveball.
Yeah, for sure. And for us, I mean, it was multiple factors. One, we're Levi and I are in a position where we can spend more money on a project like this and try and make this as high quality as possible. Like, I couldn't have done this 2 years ago. And so I think we're just at a good time in season in life to be able to spend money on a kind of project and get it going. But then also for me, I've also like tried recording remotely. And once you kind of get guests used to a certain quality and the audience used to it, it's a little hard to backtrack, which for a while there, I was sort of like, oh, this might sort of backfire in a way, because we sort of went almost too good too early. Not that I think we're too good, but it's a little like at this point, dropping a complete remote episode would be interesting. I think it can be done, like, for sure. But yeah, we're trying to figure it out. The other thing for me is I love the relationship aspect, and like video is amazing, but a lot of times I'll either like have breakfast or coffee with the guest before I even go on the episode with them or on the interview, or we'll go to dinner or drinks afterwards, or I'll just get more time with them And so a lot of the guests are individuals who I'm building a much bigger relationship with than just a single episode. Most of them, not all of them. And even though we've traveled a lot, it's all been to like, we try and be strategic. So I'll pick, a city ahead of time and try and hit up like a couple people there who I want on the podcast. So, would I travel completely to like, I don't know, the middle of nowhere, Washington to record with one person? Maybe if it's the like right guy. Usually honestly, I line up like a lot of photography meetings while I'm there. So it's usually bigger cities, and like I'm planning a trip to LA and trip to Seattle and Portland and New York and other cities, Atlanta and stuff like that, where it's like, okay, I can make this trip multi-purpose, whether it's photography, multiple guests, potential contacts for other work. So I try to just be strategic with it. And, when I'm on the road, just kind of dirtbag it a little bit.
That's smart, but it's also awesome to hear that, you're still following through with that idea or belief that, the people side of it is what matters to you.
Yeah.
And it's cool that you get to develop more relationship with them outside of just the show that you're doing together.
Yeah. And, some of them, like I was just in Detroit recording with somebody at Ford and with their global brand manager, and she was awesome, but it was definitely like show up, get your equipment set up, record the episode, get out. Like, and then there's some times where the guests, we wrap up and it's getting close to dinner time and we end up hanging out till midnight over dinner and drinks and stuff. So sometimes it's like, if I would have gone, if there was no other Detroit stuff, I mean, it would have been great, but I would have also, would have been a lot of money for just one episode coming out of our pocket. So we try and just be really strategic and practical at the same time of, we're paying for all this. So what else can we do when we're there? And like New York, I can crash in my aunt's house in Brooklyn or, and sometimes like with a lot of the work I'm doing in hospitality these days, I try and reach out to contacts and do photo shoots for hotels when I'm on the road or whatever I can do to get different work as well and sort of basically back pay everything I'm spending on the podcast. So try and be practical. I realize like it's still in its early days and we've got some sweet plans for it and we're in the talks on some really cool stuff with some cool people, but right now it's all coming out of pocket. So you just got to be pretty practical about how it all works out right now.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to two things. One was that what you were talking about with just kind of some people you end up hanging out with more and some people you show up and that's just kind of it. I thought that was an interesting piece of starting a podcast was it was something that I didn't necessarily think about in terms of what your relationship ends up being like with certain people, because, even remotely, you're even one step kind of removed from that where there's a level of like cut offness almost, like it's not really like the best word to use to describe it, but because you're getting on and then you're getting off and you're not saying goodbye to someone physically, you're saying goodbye and then all of a sudden the screen minimizes and that's it. But yeah, it's interesting feeling the people that you have a little bit more rapport with compared to the people that seem like they're just answering a question and then moving on, but then also how those end up developing over time as you end up talking to people more often and kind of seeing their name show up and you end up developing more of a relationship. I just thought that whole side of things was fascinating because it doesn't, at least for me, it wasn't necessarily something that I thought about going into it.
Yeah. And the other day I had a really cool moment where I was at a coffee shop here in Denver and there was two guests that have been on my podcast that didn't know each other. And I was having coffee with one of them and I saw the other guy walk in and I was like, oh, Hunter, come over here. Like, this is Roberto. He was episode 2 and you're like episode 5, I think it was. And it was just like this really cool moment where I was like, oh, hey, 2 of you guys in person and got to connect them both. So that was pretty fun. Yeah, for me, people mean a lot. And I mean, yeah, FaceTime and Google Hangouts and Skype, like that's all great. But I'm willing to at least pay for people's presence. So
totally.
Yeah. I don't know, you got to be strategic. It's just like any other. I think there's podcasts that are great and will always be sort of a side project, and they're great, but we want this thing to be kind of much bigger than what it is now, and we're just sort of willing to spend money on that. And it's the same way, like as a photographer, I grew those projects that I was paying out of pocket to travel somewhere, hoping I could sell images from that place, right? It's the same as any other project. You put a lot into it, hoping and probably being strategic, and you have a plan, but a lot of it, like just hoping that, you're like my trip. And I ended up working with Smartwool on some stuff when I was out there, but I just booked it, and I was hoping someone would be into the idea of having images from Nepal. So it's a lot of like just risk taking, and it's not like we're taking huge risks right now. But
I wonder what would happen if you just showed up in some city with all the gear in your backpack and like showed up to a business and we're like, hey, we're here to do a podcast. Let's who do you think's down? And just like see if there's someone that's willing to go for it.
Yeah, I'm sure I could probably pull that off. I've done crazier stuff.
The other thing that I was going to bring up too was the fact that you had just mentioned most of this is, if not all of it's, out of pocket. Did you think through any sort of monetization things when you were going into it, or is that something that you are thinking about now, or is it something that you're just going to kind of handle once you get more guests on and kind of get the steam going a little bit more?
Yeah, no, there's been a plan from the beginning, and we're in the talks with some folks right now, and so hopefully the next couple months it'll be obvious that it's monetized. But for me, the what I can say at the moment is that there's different ways to like monetize podcasts, and for me, I've always just wanted to work with companies that sort of aligns on the vision of the podcast and wanted to be more than just an ad on an episode, and really wanted to partner on a deeper level, and had a vision for taking the keys beyond just a podcast and just audio. And we've got a vision for how this thing can live in very different ways as well, and so beyond just a podcast. So I've been trying to find the right partners, and I'm also not saying we're like super big yet and ready for I'm not trying to say we're like Joe Rogan monetizing the Joe Rogan or whatever. But there was a plan from the beginning to like understand and know how to begin to monetize, and a lot of that plan included we were picky is not the right word. I just wanted the right partner who like really valued what we were doing, and could align on that. And we're having some super exciting conversations right now with some folks. So can't really say anything about it.
That's great.
If things pan out the way we're kind of beginning these conversations, then it'll be pretty fun.
I think it's cool too because it shows with how you guys set up the website, because there's pieces of it where you can tell that you're kind of starting to do these offshoots of how you're explaining and presenting the content that I think a lot of podcasts haven't gone off into. It's like this bigger form of how you're telling the story instead of just this audio piece. And I thought that was really cool when I saw it, because it backs up what you were just saying of you want it to be this bigger thing. Because I think people nowadays, they crave more of this long form content, but they also want an ability to interact with it and understand it more than just whatever single medium that it's on. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, not just for you guys, but for brands as a whole, to really create like this whole space involved with how they're presenting these things, instead of it just being an ad or just being a magazine or a catalog or, whatever one single medium that it lives in.
Yeah.
Cool. What can you speak to any potential moves that you guys are trying to plan in the future in terms of like how you're building out the episodes or the website or anything like that?
Yeah. So one of my goals from the beginning was to have a lot more visual component to the Keys podcast. And there's a reason why we try and call it just the Keys, is to try and get, people understanding that ultimately in the future, this will be bigger than just a podcast. But so yeah, the Keys podcast is the Keys podcast. But my goal, and this is all goes back to like, at some point, yeah, I'm starting to spend too much, Levi and I, out of our own pocket, and we just can't. The goal is always, let's say I'm recording with a guest in LA, is to be able to spend much more time with them and create content of their entire like day. And so, for example, I don't know, trying to think, let's say Chris Burkard's on my podcast and I'm recording with him. Like, what I would love to be doing is photographing his day, building out articles and all sorts of other stuff that's going along with the podcast episode. And so ultimately the Keys is an educational platform to help individuals become a key player. And so when you listen to, as an example, Chris Burkard, his episode, he's not been on our podcast, fully example, but you listen to the episode and then you're like, oh, I wonder what his studio is like. And you get a full visual of his studio, and potentially, depending on the guest, it's like, oh, I can watch this 3-minute film about the guest. And so my goal is to provide a lot more content about the guests themselves. And yeah, I mean, we're gonna grow out all sorts of content. And ultimately the Keys is an educational platform to help people become a key player. So we're working on it right now. A lot of it is, budget restrictions, because yeah, it's funny, as much as I want to do that, what ends up happening is, like, when I plan a trip to, let's say, New York, my main goal is, okay, I just spent all this money to get here and be here for 3 days. I'm going to line up as many meetings as I can for photography so that I can land some new work and then continue to make money and pay for the podcast so that I can be here. And then, like, I'm just going to record with as many people as I can. And so, everyone we've recorded with in New York, it's like, yeah, I want to spend the rest of the day with you after our episode and record or shoot photos and potentially do some video stuff and all these other things. But the reality is, like, that means I'm going to miss like 4 potential meetings that can lead to photography work, which right now that's what funds the podcast. So, yeah, I mean, we've got a fun thing going on and excited for it. And yeah,
some good, the overall vision sounds incredible, and I'm absolutely pumped to follow along. But yeah, it definitely seems like it's a rock and a hard place kind of thing, where you're like nudging your way through it little bits at a time, because you kind of got to balance the two sides of how you're making it all work to fit in with each other.
Yeah. And so, and at the same time too, I don't want to get too ahead of myself and start going crazy. Like, I want to, I just bought a couple of books on journalism and interviewing, and I want to get really good on, I want people to also be excited to listen to the podcast before it's like, okay, before I add all this other stuff, I want to make sure people even like listening to me and my guest and stuff. So first, I don't want to get too ahead of myself. I want to definitely become as good as I can as a host, and then start adding on these other things. But yeah, if you go to our website, like every guest we've had, we definitely kind of Q&A a little bit, or take some of the stuff from the podcast and turn it into a blog post. And we try and, I mean, because Levi and I are both photographers, we definitely bring our cameras to almost every interview and try and snap as much original content as possible. I think Rivian was a good example of us, like, that's a new car company, all electric, and we've gotten to go there a couple times and shoot some behind the scenes stuff there. So, there's things like that where I think we've gotten some cool opportunities. Like, hey, you listen to this episode at Rivian, like, here's the behind the scenes into their studio and what that looks like. And here's the behind the scenes of Larry, who's their creative director. Like, we threw up some photos that he gave us of his garage and like at his home and some other things in his personal life. And so trying to add more content that's about the person. So if you're interested, if that episode really stuck out to you and you learned a lot from that person, hopefully you can get like a visual aid into their life, because a lot of people learn visually and that helps them almost more than listening to a podcast, or it helps them take in what they listen to. So yeah, that's some of the stuff we're doing right now, and planning some live podcast events as well, where we, being such a people person and liking, obviously I go to every guest. So for me, it's like, I love that. I crave the interaction. And so a live podcast event is, we can hopefully gather a lot of people and a couple guests and have a really good time together in a big space. But yeah, I got to go to Chaco's headquarters in Grand Rapids recently and talk about the podcast to a room full of people, and that was really cool. And they asked me all about like the guests and the things I'm learning, and talked about a lot of this and stuff. So it was cool. It was like my first time being somewhere for the podcast in a room full of people, and so it was a cool like first physical extension of the podcast.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because you almost gotta like, you're talking about how you're trying to structure the podcast, and in doing so you're doing more talking and interacting with more people almost in the exact same way that you would be doing if it was recorded.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah, well, sweet. Yeah, to wrap things up a little bit, if you were to give some advice to some other people in terms of, whether they're wanting to get into the outdoor industry or just understand more about marketing, behind the scenes of content, how a brand works, any piece of the plethora of things that you kind of have your hands involved in, what would some pieces of advice be?
Say like really care about people. That's going to take you super far. And by that, I mean, like, even if you're applying for a job, like just care about people, and don't always try and view them as like a step forward or something that can get you somewhere. I would say like that. That's my biggest thing. But also in the outdoor space, I guess just like take the time. It depends. There's like, if you're trying to be in sales, there's in the outdoor industry, that's like a whole different thing. But I guess for this podcast and the careers you and I are kind of in, like sticking to more creative sort of realm, just really take time to learn what a story actually is. Because if you're a photographer or journalist or writer or blogger, whatever, just don't pitch a company unless you know it's like a good story and there's actually a story there. Like traveling somewhere. And yeah, traveling somewhere is not a story. It's a fact. Like you went somewhere, you did something. But so if you're trying to become a photographer or blogger, writer, whatever, yeah, just take some time and like before you pitch somebody and try and get some money from a company, just remember to ask yourself like, what's the story here, and is there a story? So yeah, people and stories, I would say, is like what kind of matters most. But I don't know, be willing to put your time into. Like I was making a lot more money in North Carolina, and then moved to Denver with like just a savings account and started at Topo. And it was not making. I mean, I was their fifth or sixth employee. Like I wasn't making anything, but you gotta like be willing to put your time in. And I realized like if you're later on in your career, that might be hard, but yeah, just be willing to put time in. And that was a huge takeaway from like all the guests we've had on ours, is they were willing to take like personal ownership of whatever they were doing. And Mackie Saturday, who's a graphic designer, he was a middle school teacher, and he stepped down because he realized like I'm not passionate about teaching middle school kids, and I'm hurting their education if I'm not like excited about this. And so he had the like enough care about people, about his students, and like enough integrity and personal ownership to step down and like learn how to be a graphic designer. Essentially, he took one graphic design course, and he was a fine arts major with in blacksmithing. So anyways, he was like, I'm going to step down from being a middle school teacher. I'm going to really, if I'm going to choose to do that and choose this new career, like I'm going to own that and give him my best. And ultimately he's designed the Instagram word mark, and he's the silk, like soy milk and all that stuff, like silk milk, just done some really cool projects. So I don't know, my big takeaway from that was like, take personal ownership and care about people. I don't know. Hopefully that's some good advice.
Awesome. No, I think the simpler the better almost, because it's stuff that ends up standing the test of time and, you know, through different projects and, you know, different changes that happen with life.
Yeah.
So where can people find more of the Keys, and where can they find more of your personal stuff?
Yeah. So the Keys podcast, you have to type the full thing, the Keys podcast on iTunes or Spotify. If you type just the Keys, it'll pop up. It's like, there's a lot of like the Keys things. So anyways, you can find us on Overcast, iTunes, Spotify, basically anywhere you can find a podcast. Type the Keys podcast. You can also find us on www. I don't even know why I just said www. No one said that's hilarious. Just type in thekeyspodcast.com. You don't have to type the W's. No one. Yeah, thekeyspodcast.com. All of the other spots you find your podcasts, and on Instagram it's the Keys Podcast. And then personally, you can follow my stuff on Joshua Edric, EDRIC, my Instagram handle, joshuaedric.com, my website. So
awesome. Sweet, yeah, man. Thanks. Well, I appreciate it. We're going to have to get on another one of these in the future as you get further into stuff, because I'm so excited to see what it turns into. Like your vision for what it's going to be. I can, you know, maybe I can't see it fully in terms of where you have it, but it sounds like it's going to be really awesome.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. I know that interviews get exhausting too. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, anytime. For me, it's more of the scheduling side of it that gets difficult, because I'm, you know, like just one person.
2 hours ahead too, so I know it's a little late for you.
It's all good, man. I love talking to people, especially when they're doing stuff like you are, where you just, you know, throw yourself in and handle it.
Cool. All right. Awesome. Thanks, Nick.
Yep. Take it easy.